I think the one way to understand what's going on is to take an income statement view of the economy. In other words, what drives our income and how we've been spending and any deficits that may arise. And I think if you take that view, then it becomes, suppose, easier to understand how the slowdown in China, the decline in commodity prices, has hurt the revenue line of not only us, but other commodity-producing economies, and led to rising not only government budget deficits, but also current account deficits, which then require funding. The Federal Reserve then signaling a desire to ever so slightly edge up rates from time to time makes the funding of our current account deficits via the ebbing and flowing of portfolio flows dearer. So we've had almost a perfect storm where commodity prices have declined and the cost of funding external imbalances and government deficits has become dearer. What must then happen, obviously, is you must adjust your spending downwards, and at least that's happening in South Africa, and it's happening partly because interest rates are higher, partly because government spending is lower, taxes have been raised, credit growth is weak, and employment is also weak. So we've seen spending growth slow down significantly, which is also appropriate. I think the silver lining is that the adjustment is happening. So the significant slowdown we've seen in domestic demand is actually leading to a decline in imports, which is desirable if you are trying to live or head in the direction of living within your means. The fact that we now have a trade surplus for the first 7 months of the year, cumulative, I think attests to this adjustment, albeit it's happening very painfully because it's only happening via the expenditure side. So, I mean, we're almost trying to shrink our way into greatness. What's not happening is that the production side of the economy and the export side of the economy is not responding to stable global growth and a significantly more competitive exchange rate as it probably should, and I think that has to do with a lot. That has a lot to do with the fact that fixed investment is quite weak. In fact, it's contracting in the private sector, which is pulling down overall fixed investment growth. And that then, in turn, has a lot to do with the fact that business confidence in South Africa is very weak. And if you drill down into some of the things holding back business confidence, is the fact that the private sector is rating the domestic political climate as a constraint to do business at a very high level. So animal spirits are being held back by politics. It's holding back fixed investment, which is holding back the production and export efforts of South Africa. If you try and decipher what could potentially happen to our rating, I think we can get a tick in terms of fiscal consolidation, in terms of the way monetary policy has responded to try and reduce inflation. Inflation is not going to be a problem. I think where we are vulnerable is the fact that rating agencies care about growth, which is what ultimately drives fiscal revenues, and we don't think growth is going to be there. We have a growth forecast of 0.2% for this year, and growth not reaching 2% out to 2019, which means this is probably, if we are correct in terms of our longer-term forecast, going to be the second weakest 5-year period post the Second World War. And so I think because of that growth vulnerability, and then if you overlay the untidiness of our domestic political arrangements, I think that increases the odds of us being downgraded either in December or in June next year. Yeah, so I mean, overall, you may have GDP growth on average being very weak, but if you disaggregate it, there are pockets of strength. So if you, for example, look at the retail sector, overall, it's holding up quite well. You drill deeper into that, you find the thing that's pulling it down is spending or sales of durable goods like appliances and furniture. What you then find is that the more defensive parts of retail are actually quite resilient. So food and beverage, general dealers, clothing and footwear and pharmaceuticals, and that in turn is causing resilience in those defensive sectors down the supply chain. So you're finding similar trends appearing in the wholesale sector, and you're finding similar trends appearing in the manufacturing sector. So to the extent that you are exposed to those sectors, I think you should find that there remain opportunities, obviously within reason, but yes, that resilience is still there, and I think the reason why it's still there is because wage growth for those formerly employed and also asset price growth has actually meant that the finances of high-income households have held up. If you look at residential housing demand, that is weak, I think, and that coincides with the fact that credit growth for mortgages has been exceptionally weak for almost half a decade now, if not more. I think that's a function of households being or not having a lot of confidence and adopting a very defensive posture, but I think it also has a lot to do with more stringent credit granting criteria. So as a consequence, you are seeing very muted, albeit resilient, house price growth in the normal market, right? If you then look at RDP houses, we continue to see where there was a shortage, government is doing fixed investment there to try and close that gap. That continues, and we see it in very strong fixed investment by general government, if not so much from the state-owned enterprises. And I think the other issue is the gap market for people that don't qualify for RDP houses but don't have quite a level of income and affordability to get into the I don't want to call it the formal market, but there is that gap market which has always been suboptimally serviced by financial institutions, although a lot has been done to try and close that gap. And then if you look in terms of housing supply, if we look at building plans passed, if we look at investment in residential fixed investment, there's very mediocre growth there, and I think that's a function of a lack of confidence, but also a lack of sufficient demand from the end consumer. What we know is that for each percentage point increase in GDP growth, you should see formal employment growth grow by between 0.5% and 0.6%. So to the extent that our economic growth projections are as weak as they are, and we're talking essentially between 0 and 2% growth for 5 years, I think you're going to see very muted employment growth. So by definition, if you are seeing between, say, 10 and 100,000 new jobs being created every year for out to 2019, which is consistent with our weak GDP growth forecast, and 400,000 to 500,000 new individuals entering the job market, it means that we are not creating enough jobs to mop up new entrants, which by definition means that the unemployment rate is probably going to increase.